Hello and welcome to the Craft Beer Corner. For today's review, we are doing two different brewers, but the same style. We're jumping in yet again to some porters. These are two porters I have never had, and it's one of my favorite styles, so I'm always excited and I'm always on the lookout for new ones I haven't tried. For today, we're going to be starting first with Scuttlebutt Brewing Company's Porter, aptly named Porter. 5.5% on this one, and they are based out of Everett, Washington. And then number two is from Highland Brewing Company. This is their Oatmeal Porter, again aptly named Oatmeal Porter. This one clocks in at 5.9% ABV, and they are based out of Asheville, North Carolina. So two porters, only a slight variance in ABV. One's an oatmeal-based style, one's just a standard classic porter with no oat. And we're going to see what these two bring to the table. So without further ado, we're going to jump right in, starting with the Scuttlebutt Porter. This one's 5.5% ABV. Okay, so jumping into our first beer of today's porter review, this is the Scuttlebutt Brewing Company's Porter. It's just called Porter. 5.5% ABV on this one. They are based out of Everett, Washington. In terms of bottle art on the label, they do have a nautical theme. They've got a mermaid on the side out in the sea, and there are some fish swimming around the mermaid. I'm going to try to angle it so there's no glare from the set lights and get it as close as I can, but looks pretty neat. Nice label art, and I like the kind of chocolate brown color on that label. Gets me in the mood for a nice dark beer. So let's get this one cracked. All right. Poured right into our porter glass, of course. All right. Now, right away, this looks like a classic porter. It's dark, but not too dark, and it's got a good bit of effervescence. Typically, they don't hold the best head in the world because they too tend to be a pretty effervescent style. This one formed one, but I can see it's quite active in terms of carbonation. I don't expect it's going to retain other than maybe some cling on the sides, but that's okay. Holding it up to the light, this is a classic porter appearance. It's a very dark brown, somewhere between a stout and a nut brown ale, really, in terms of depth of color. And it's not pitch black. You can see light through it, although it's not clear. It's very dark, but in spots where the glass is less thick, you can see through it. So that is prototypical for porter. Head still holding okay, more or less. Got some cling on the sides, just a little floating on top. Let's give this a sniff. Not a super duper pronounced aroma. I can smell it. It's got a very classic porter aroma about it. There's a slight roastiness to the malts that come through and a slight sweetness to the malts that come through. That's very typical for a porter. It's got this slight deep fruit kind of aroma too. That often comes through with the malt bill in porters. Kind of love it or hate it. I like the more roasty edge, but it's not uncommon for there to be kind of a rich, deep fruit. Raisins, prunes are relatively common, plums occasionally, but let's jump in. Give this a sip, see what this one's about. Okay. Oh, it's a very nice porter indeed. Very nice indeed. Okay. This porter harkens me back to the first porter I ever had. That is the porter that got me in love with the style. This is one where the deep roast malt characteristic really comes through in the flavor profile. And although you do smell kind of some rich, deep fruit on the aroma from the malt, it doesn't translate into the actual flavor of the beer at all. It's all about the rich, roasty edge to the malts. It takes on this slight, kind of coffee-like and kind of smoky. It's kind of a combination between the two. It's not the same as a French roast coffee I talk about often, where the beans are on the edge of being burned. Not that deep, rich, intense. It's lighter. Like a good cup of coffee that's pretty strong, but it's not the most bold blend. That's what this reminds me of. It's that type of roasty edge to the malt, both in terms of coffee presence, in terms of flavor, and that same kind of smoky, roasty edge to it. It's about that same intensity. So it's very well balanced. This is a prototypical classic porter. I'm going to jump in for body mouthfeel and see how all these flavors develop and finish out. body, I would say, overall is medium light. 5.5%, that's right around where I thought it would be. So it's perfectly in range for the ABV. Mouthfeel is again a prototypical porter. It tends to be a more effervescent style, so it doesn't get super creamy because it's so active in the mouth. But once it starts rolling around the palate, it does take on a greater sense of thickness and viscosity to it. And it does take on a slightly creamy quality, but never quite fully gets there because there's so much carbonation that's happening. It doesn't lush up. It's not like being on a hand pull cask or off of a nitro tap at a bar or anything like that. But it's very much in range for the beer style. I'm going to jump in one more time, see how these flavors develop. You first get it in your mouth. There's the suggestion of sweetness from the malts, and that slowly dissipates as the roasty edge of the malts completely open up and dominate. Porters are a beer style that's all about the malt. It is all about the malt, how the malt flavor and aroma develop, and what happens with them across the ride of each sip. That's what a porter is all about. A lot of people think it's a weaker style comparative to a stout. That's not really true. You could make an argument for ABV, and there's a whole lot of debate about what differentiates a porter and a stout. I've made mention about that in other videos. I'm not going to go into that here, but a porter does not have to be what people consider often to be a watered down version of a stout. It is not at all. It's its own animal, and they are equally bold. This is a very flavor forward, very dominant roasty malt edge that comes through in this beer. This is a pretty big porter for my money, and it's not an imperial. If they made this in imperial form, wow, I can't even imagine. I don't know if they offer an imperial porter in their lineup at all. This is the first beer I've ever had by this brewer, but I can tell you this is an excellent prototypical porter. This is a very, very well done example of what a porter should be. The balance on this is fantastic. All of the different layers of nuance of what the malts chosen are doing in this beer come through both in the aroma and in the flavor. And honestly, for a porter at 5.5%, it's got good staying power. It's got a pretty long finish. I can still taste that roasty, kind of malty, cereal-like, and coffee and smoky edge to it. It's just lingering on my palate, and it's lovely. I'm going to take my time, sip on this one, count my scores. When we come back, we're going to jump over to the Highland Brewing Company's Oatmeal Porter. That one clocks in at 5.9% ABV. Okay, moving on to our second beer. This is the Highland Brewing Company's Oatmeal Porter. This one's 5.9% ABV, and they are based in Asheville, North Carolina. And as an aside, Asheville, North Carolina happens to be another one of the major craft brewing hotbeds in the southeastern United States. Sierra Nevada has a brewing outfit up there. Actually, it's a really stunning facility. If you're anywhere near the area and you haven't been, I highly recommend it. It's a gorgeous building and a really fantastic restaurant as well, just as an aside. But nonetheless, let's jump into this Highland. In terms of label art, it's just got some local Asheville kind of theme. This is clearly the Smoky Mountains on the label. If you didn't know, Asheville, North Carolina is sitting in the Smoky Mountains and the Blue Ridge Mountains. It's right in the middle of multiple mountain ranges. It's a gorgeous, gorgeous city if you've never been there. But let's get this cracked, and we're going to get this poured right into the glass. Yet again, got a classic porter color. This one's maybe a little bit lighter than the prior, quite a bit effervescent, so it'll form a decent head to start, but I don't expect this one either will have much in the way of staying power, just due to how highly carbonated they tend to be. Visually, this is pretty close to the last one, though it is noticeably a bit easier to see through. In fact, if I hold this up to the light, I can actually see through this significantly further up the glass than I could in the Scuttlebutt Brewing offering. So it is a little bit lighter, but it's still perfectly in range for a porter. Head's actually holding pretty decent. Let's give this a sniff. Wow, okay. So aroma-wise, this one actually has a little more pronounced aroma than the Scuttlebutt did. And in terms of aroma, it smells again like a textbook quintessential porter aroma. It is almost indistinguishable from the Scuttlebutt, other than maybe it's a bit more pronounced on this one. Smells like a classic porter. You get a mix of the roasty malt back and some deep, rich kind of fruit aroma. It's very, very common with porters. It'll be interesting to see if that flavor comes through in this one, because often that aroma it matches a flavor in a porter beer. It's not uncommon. It's not the norm, but it's not uncommon. So let's go ahead and dive right in. This head is almost completely gone, as I thought it would be. Let's jump in and give this a sip. Okay, that's quite nice. That's quite nice. This one is a bit tamer, a bit milder in terms of intensity of flavor comparative to the prior, but it's very, very nice. And again, it's another classic porter. One thing I noticed right off the bat as I rolled around my palate, the fact that this is an oatmeal porter really shows in the mouthfeel. It's a lot creamier and it lushes up and gets really silky with just the slightest agitation around the palate as you're letting it get all around to pick up the flavors. Albeit the flavors aren't as intense as in the prior. It still has that classic porter, very roasty malt kind of edge to it. This one is another one where those kind of rich, deep fruit that you get in the aroma did not come through in the actual beer itself, which I actually prefer in a porter. I like the roasty edge, leave kind of the fruity side out, but it's nice. It's much more tame. It's much more subtle. It's got some interesting flavor layering, however. There is definitely a smoky edge to it, a roasted malt edge to it, and a coffee edge to it, but it's all just dialed back a bit. It's a bit more mellow in its approach. I'm going to jump in for the body. I already got the mouthfeel, and I want to see where these flavors develop. Body on this one is medium, actually bordering on medium heavy. It's an impressive body, certainly for the ABV. Yeah, it's very nice. I'll tell you on a second sip, really I think what it is the intensity of flavor comes on the front on this one versus opening up like most beers do. It's really intense up front and then it starts a steady decline. It doesn't build in intensity, it decreases steadily from the point that you get it in your mouth. But it's very enjoyable. There's only a slight hint of malty sweetness, and maybe a little bit of it that comes from the oatmeal. That can often happen. And actually, speaking of the oatmeal, I'm surprised that the head didn't form and retain any better than it did, because oats are the #1 best way to help a beer generate and retain a head. So I am a little surprised it didn't do a better job at the head formation and retention, but it hands down added to the creamy mouthfeel. It really, I mean, barely agitate it when you get it in your mouth, and it just starts to get even thicker than it naturally is. And this beer has some viscosity, even if you don't roll it around the palate, you can feel it. It's got thickness to it. Very good. Very, very good beer. Classic porter. Yeah, it's that slight sweetness up front, and there's maybe even a hint of a kind of a chocolate malt and a caramel malt mix. Not that I would suspect that they're in, possibly chocolate malt, but certainly not caramel malt. I wouldn't suspect is in this. It's possible that they put some in, but that comes through just in the front, and then it really is just that intensity of kind of the smoky and roasty edge to the malt, and this kind of coffee flavors that come through that are very classic in most porters and indeed most stouts. Excellent, excellent beer. Very well balanced. This one is just another great example of a beer that's all about the malt. Porters are one of my favorite styles for this, and they're all a little bit different. You never really know what you're going to get, but such an enjoyable beer style. I really, really love them. This is a nice, well done, classic example of a porter. I'm going to take my time, sip on this, count my scores, and when we come back, we will get both beers ranked from top to bottom. Okay, now that we've gotten to have both of these beers, we're going to get them ranked, starting with the Scuttlebutt Brewing Company's Porter. Porter is the name of it. 5.5%. Again, they are based out of Everett, Washington. For the aroma on this one, the aroma was nice. I could smell the malt bill, and it had very much a classic porter aroma, albeit not super pronounced. It was average range. It gets a 5. The taste on this, very, very nice classic porter flavor. And for a 5.5%, that's really sitting right in the mid-range for a porter, or maybe even mid-high. But the flavors really came through quite strongly. All the classic flavors I expect in a porter, and really with pretty good intensity. Had that nice smoky edge to it, that slight coffee flavor to it, that slight kind of chocolate malt flavor to it. Really all kind of came through, and none of the fruity flavors that can sometimes come through in a porter, which I don't personally care for, came through at all. It was all about the rich, deep, roasted edge to the malts, and did a great job. I gave it a 9 out of 10. Body on this. The body was really close to perfect for the ABV, and for a porter in that range, for my money, I only docked 1 point. I gave it a 9. Mouthfeel on this one. Excellent mouthfeel on a porter. Porters, they don't tend to be as creamy as their stout counterparts. Part of the reason is they tend to be a lot more effervescent, and that's true in this case. But this was very, very close to what I expected for a porter. Only missed the mark by 1 point. I gave it a 9. Finish on this one. This actually had a pretty decently long finish for a porter, certainly well above average. The roasty edge that kept coming through and the coffee edge that kept coming through, that was kind of where it finished in this one, and really had a good bit of longevity to it on each sip. Only 1 point shy for my money at the top tier porters. I gave it a 9. Head and retention on this one. It was okay. It was kind of low end of average. It formed okay, but it collapsed pretty quickly. Porters, that can often happen. Again, they're a lot more effervescent. So when you have all of that active carbonation, it can just collapse the head, and that did happen in this case. I gave it low end of average. It gets a 4. Appearance-wise, this was a textbook porter, beautiful dark. You could still see light through it. It's not as pitch black as a stout or an imperial, but it was textbook for the style. It gets a 10 out of 10. Balance on this one. Porter is a style that's all about the malt, and if the malt bill is done well and it's done in the right ratios, a porter is just a beautiful thing, and I thought that they executed this one beautifully. The balance of the malts that they used really let all the independent parts shine without overshadowing really any of the others. So you got a lot of interesting flavor elements as the flavor progressed on each sip. I give it a perfect 10 out of 10. Feeling in the intangible. I really, really enjoyed this one. Were it able to get top marks in several of the categories where I docked points, I probably subjectively would have given this a 10, but I really would have liked a little more aroma with a 5.5% ABV in there. And frankly, while it is relatively common for porters, I do like the head to have a bit more creation and retention than this one gave me. I gave it a 9 for feeling in the intangible. Finally, as an example of the style, I think this is an exceptional porter. Very, very well done. Certainly well above average. If you like a classic standard porter, I think this is an excellent, excellent example. I only docked 1 point for having multiple categories where it wasn't top marks, but it gets a 9. That brings the total score on the Scuttlebutt Brewing Company's porter to an 83 out of 100. So a very, very high score. Certainly well above average. If you like a classic standard porter, no imperial, no additives, just a porter true to the style, all about the malt base, this is an excellent one. I do recommend it. Moving on to our second beer. This is the Highland Brewing Company's Oatmeal Porter. Again, just called Oatmeal Porter. This one's 5.9% ABV, so 0.4 higher than the prior. And Highland Brewing is based out of Asheville, North Carolina. The aroma on this one. The aroma on this one was similar to the Scuttlebutt. It was nice. You could smell kind of the classic porter malt back aromas, but it did come through a little more strongly than in the Scuttlebutt. I gave it high end of average. I gave it a 6. For the taste on this one, I was actually a little surprised because it had a little higher ABV, and I expected maybe a little more volume of fermentables in there, obviously, to get the ABV up. Though really when I was looking at it, it didn't look quite as deep of a color, so that was probably my first clue before I ever jumped in. It was a very nice flavor. This, similar to the Scuttlebutt, was a classic porter, all about the malts, but it didn't come through with quite the same intensity. What I got was very nice, certainly well above average, but just a little dialed down compared to the Scuttlebutt. I gave it an 8 out of 10. Body on this one. The body was excellent. This actually had a lot more robust body than I anticipated. Even though 5.9, that's kind of getting to the high end of average and into the higher end of a standard porter, but it really had some excellent substance. It was very weighty in the mouth. I enjoyed it thoroughly. I gave it a 10 out of 10. Mouthfeel on this one. Mouthfeel on this was exceptional. Given that it was an oatmeal porter, I wasn't particularly surprised that it ended up being quite a bit creamier than your average porter. You could still feel the effervescence in your mouth, but once you add oats to a beer, it does a few things for it, and mouthfeel is one of the areas it really does impact, and it made a big difference in this one. I give it a perfect 10 out of 10. For the finish. The finish on this one kind of threw me for a loop. Even though the flavors weren't as pungent, I expected with that higher ABV and how it creamed around the palate and had nice viscosity, that it would stick around a little longer than it did on each sip, but it kind of died out relatively quickly, certainly comparative to the prior porter that we sampled. It still did a good job. I give it high end of average. I give it a 6. Head and retention on this one, pretty much identical to the first one, only again, I was a little surprised by this one because it was an oatmeal porter, and oat is the #1 best ingredient you can add to a beer if you want to help with head creation and retention. But it pretty much mimicked what happened on the Scuttlebutt. It just collapsed too quickly due to the effervescence and was gone. The oats didn't really help it retain. It gets a 4 out of 10. Moving on to the appearance. Well, it's true this one was a little bit lighter than the prior. You could see a lot more light through it, a lot further up in the glass. It was still right in the perfect textbook range for a porter. It gets a 10 out of 10. For the balance, again, I thought that this was a beautifully balanced beer. A porter is really not a complicated style. It's really all about the malts and kind of how you put them together. It's relatively easy to mess up depending on what ratios of malts that you use. I know this from brewing. I brewed a lot of porters in trial and error, but this was an excellent porter that I thought they balanced very, very well. Albeit it wasn't as pungent in multiple areas compared to the prior. The balance, I can't fault anything in it. I gave it a perfect 10 out of 10. Feeling in the intangibles. I enjoyed this one. I really did, and I certainly think it is well above average. But there were, just as with the Scuttlebutt, a few areas where I would have liked just a little more intensity. I gave it an 8 out of 10. Finally, as an example of the style, as a porter, both of these these are classic porters. You can't go wrong with either of them. It's kind of personal preference what you like. If you like a little more intense, a little less intense, a little more creamy, a little more effervescent. They were very, very closely aligned. Very different in their approach and certainly in the end result when it comes to what we perceived with all of our senses. But they both did an excellent job, and they are both truly great examples of what a standard porter is. Just as with the prior, I gave this one a 9 out of 10. That brings the total score on the Highland Brewing's Oatmeal Porter to an 81 out of 100. So only a 2-point spread here, 83 and an 81. Both remarkably similar, but different in their own rights. They both had their independent strengths and weaknesses, but I really enjoyed both of these as great examples of what a classic standard porter can and should be. Folks, that's today's review. As always, I do sincerely appreciate you tuning in today. Please don't forget to like, comment, subscribe. Likes really help the channel. Subscribe will help you keep our videos in your feed. If you ever lose them, you can go to your subscriptions and catch up on any content you missed. And comments, I want to hear from you. Let me know what your thoughts are, your opinions, feelings, suggestions, questions, stuff you'd like to see, beers you'd like me to review. Let me know down in the comments. I am here for you. Lastly, if you want to keep in the loop when our videos go live to YouTube, you can just click the notification bell icon. It is right next to the subscribe button. Till next time, folks, keep it beer, keep it craft. We'll see you on the next one. Cheers.